The moment the pantry door slammed shut behind us, my best friend, Tessa Whitmore, stopped breathing, not because we were trapped, but because she had seen the faded photograph taped beneath a shelf. Her face drained of color as she tore it down with shaking fingers, and when I looked over her shoulder, I saw two smiling little girls standing beside the woman Tessa had always called Aunt Marlene. One girl was Tessa. The other was my mother. Before I could ask why, Tessa whispered that the photograph was never supposed to exist, and in that cramped pantry filled with flour sacks, dusty jars, and afternoon sunlight leaking through a narrow vent, I realized my best friend had been hiding something that could destroy everything I believed about my family. Before I tell you what happened next, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances. Your support helps our community keep sharing stories that remind us that even the deepest wounds can become the beginning of healing. Tessa and I had been inseparable since our first year of college. We met when she spilled iced coffee across my sociology notes and offered to rewrite every page by hand. She was the kind of person who remembered how I took my tea, noticed when I was pretending to be fine, and showed up at my apartment with groceries whenever my paycheck arrived late. I knew she had been raised by her Aunt Marlene after her mother, Claire, died in a highway accident when Tessa was 8. I also knew Marlene lived alone in an old farmhouse outside Bellwether, Vermont, surrounded by apple trees and stone walls built before either of us was born. What I did not know was that Marlene had once known my mother, Rebecca Hale, or that Tessa had spent the last 3 years quietly uncovering a connection between our families. We had driven to the farmhouse that bright Saturday morning because Marlene had fallen and injured her wrist. Tessa wanted to help organize the house before a home care nurse arrived the following week. At first, the visit felt ordinary. Marlene sat in the sunroom with her arm in a brace, directing us toward boxes of canned food and expired baking supplies. Then, while we were carrying jars into the pantry, an old latch shifted on the outside of the door. A heavy wooden cabinet, loosened by years of uneven flooring, slid against it. We shouted for Marlene, but her hearing aids were charging in the kitchen, and the thick walls swallowed our voices. The pantry was narrow enough that our shoulders nearly touched. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling, crowded with preserved peaches, soup cans, candles, and boxes labeled in Marlene's slanted handwriting. Tessa kept staring at the photograph as though it had accused her of a crime. I took it from her and examined the date written on the back. June 14, 1998. My mother would have been 19. In the picture, she stood with one arm around Claire Whitmore and the other around Marlene. All three looked young and happy, their faces bright in the summer sun. Tessa finally admitted that she had found letters after Marlene's fall, letters written by my mother to Claire. She had read only a few before guilt made her stop, but what she saw convinced her our mothers had been more than casual friends. They had planned something together, something involving a baby, a hospital, and a promise never to speak again. Tessa told me she had wanted to ask me about it many times, but my mother had died from cancer when I was 16, and she feared reopening a grief I had barely survived. Hearing that made my anger rise faster than reason. Tessa knew how many nights I had cried over unanswered questions about my mother. She knew I possessed almost nothing from Rebecca's early life because my father had thrown away her old papers after her funeral. Yet she had kept silent that I accused Tessa of choosing her comfort over my right to know the truth. She did not defend herself. Instead, she sat on an overturned bucket, pressing her palms against her knees to stop them from trembling. She confessed that there was another reason she had hidden the letters. One of them mentioned my name months before I was born, but it was written by Claire, not Rebecca. The word suggested that Claire had once believed I was her daughter. My anger collapsed into confusion. I demanded to see every letter, but Tessa explained they were locked inside Marlene's desk in the sunroom. She had planned to retrieve them during our visit, read them completely, and then decide whether the truth was strong enough to bring to me. That confession hurt more than the secret itself. She had decided she could judge which truth I deserved. I turned away from her, staring through the pantry vent at a thin rectangle of blue sky. Outside, the afternoon remained peaceful. Birds moved between apple branches, unaware that my history had just broken open. I remembered my mother's final weeks, when she had repeatedly tried to tell me something but lost her strength before she could finish. At the time, I believed she wanted to apologize for dying. Now I wondered whether she had been trying to explain how I had entered her life. Tessa searched the shelves for anything that might help us escape. Behind a stack of flour tins, she found a small wooden box sealed with a rusted clasp. Inside were birthday candles, old receipts, and a folded hospital bracelet bearing the name Claire Whitmore. The date matched my birthday. Beneath it lay a second bracelet labeled Baby Girl Whitmore. I felt the floor vanish beneath me. For 27 years, I had believed Rebecca Hale had given birth to me at a hospital in Burlington. My birth certificate listed her as my mother. My father, Peter Hale, had never suggested otherwise. Yet I was holding physical proof that a baby born to Claire Whitmore entered the world on the same day, in the same region, with no place in Tessa's family history. Tessa said Claire had suffered a complicated pregnancy before Tessa was born, but Marlene always claimed the infant had died. Her voice cracked as she admitted the truth she feared most. If I was Claire's first child, then Tessa and I were not merely friends. We were half-sisters. The idea felt impossible, yet it explained 1,000 small things I had never questioned: our similar gray-green eyes, the same dimple near our left cheeks, the way strangers occasionally asked whether we were related. The shock did not bring immediate joy. It brought grief. I thought of my mother, the woman who had raised me, sat beside me through childhood fevers, worked 2 jobs after my father's business failed, and filled lunch bags with handwritten notes telling me I was loved. Nothing could erase her place in my heart, but the possibility that she had hidden my birth from me felt like betrayal. I wondered whether I had been taken, traded, or adopted through some secret agreement. Tessa reached for my hand, but I pulled away. She lowered her arm and began crying silently. She told me Claire had struggled with addiction as a teenager after losing her father. By 19, she had become pregnant and terrified. Rebecca, her closest friend, had recently learned she could not safely carry a child because of a serious heart condition. According to the fragments Tessa had read, Claire wanted Rebecca to raise the baby temporarily while she entered treatment. But after the birth, something changed. Claire disappeared for nearly 2 years. Rebecca and Peter legally adopted the child through an attorney arranged by Marlene, though the paperwork had been sealed. When Claire returned sober, she wanted contact, but Rebecca feared losing the daughter she had already come to love. The friendship shattered. A sound finally came from the kitchen, the scrape of Marlene's chair across the floor. Tessa and I shouted until our throats hurt. Minutes later, Marlene reached the pantry and tried to move the cabinet with one good arm, but it would not shift. She called a neighbor, and while we waited, she sat on the other side of the door. Tessa told her we had found the photograph and hospital bracelets. Silence followed, heavy and complete. Then Marlene began speaking through the wood. She admitted that I had been born to Claire. Rebecca had not stolen me, and Claire had not abandoned me without love. Claire experienced a severe mental health crisis after delivery, made worse by addiction and fear. She signed temporary guardianship papers, believing she would return within 6 months. But when she recovered, Rebecca and Peter had built their lives around me. Peter threatened to expose Claire's past and fight for permanent custody. Marlene, desperate to protect both the baby and her fragile younger sister, convinced Claire that leaving me with the Hales was the safest choice. They completed a private adoption. Claire was allowed to receive photographs once a year, but Rebecca eventually stopped sending them because every contact reopened the pain. Marlene's voice weakened as she described the years that followed. Claire married, remained sober, and later had Tessa. She wanted to tell Tessa about me but feared that revealing the truth would lead me to reject Rebecca, the only mother I knew. When Claire died in the accident, Marlene inherited the burden of the secret. She kept every letter, photograph, and hospital record, telling herself she would speak when the right moment came. The right moment never came because she kept choosing another year of silence. She apologized through the door, not with excuses but with the exhausted honesty of someone who had carried shame too long. I listened with my back against the shelves, tears running down my face. I had imagined the truth as a single sharp answer, but it was a web of frightened choices made by young women who loved imperfectly. Rebecca feared losing me. Claire feared harming me. Marlene feared destroying everyone. Their silence was wrong, but it had not been born from cruelty. It had been born from love mixed with fear, and fear had slowly poisoned what love meant to protect. When the neighbor finally moved the cabinet and opened the pantry, sunlight flooded the doorway. I stepped out feeling as though I had aged years in a few hours. Marlene looked smaller than I remembered, her silver hair untidy and her injured wrist held against her chest. She expected me to leave, but I asked for the letters. We sat together at the kitchen table while afternoon light spread across the worn wood. Tessa remained nearby but did not pressure me to forgive her. Marlene unlocked a metal box and placed dozens of envelopes before me. The earliest letters were filled with hope. Claire wrote about treatment, sobriety meetings, and the dream of someday explaining that giving me to Rebecca had been an act of survival, not rejection. Later letters became sorrowful. She asked for photographs, school updates, and stories about the things that made me laugh. Rebecca's replies were defensive at first, then compassionate. In one letter, she admitted she lived with guilt every day. She wrote that she loved me too deeply to imagine losing me, but new love did not justify erasing Claire. The final letter, written shortly before Claire's death, contained a sentence that broke me open. She did not want to take me away from my mother, she only wanted me to know I had been loved by two. Tessa placed another envelope beside me. It had my name on it in Claire's handwriting. She had never opened it. Inside was a letter intended for my 18th birthday, though it had remained hidden for 9 additional years. Claire described the day I was born, the tiny curl above my ear, and the way my fingers closed around hers. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked only that I live without believing I had ever been unwanted. She wrote that Rebecca possessed a steady courage she did not have at 19, and that allowing Rebecca to raise me had been the hardest and most loving decision of her life. At the bottom, she mentioned Tessa, then only 6 years old, saying that if life were kinder, her daughters might someday meet and become friends. I looked at Tessa across the table and realized life had done something even more extraordinary. We had found each other without knowing why. We had chosen each other before blood gave us a reason. Still, discovering we were sisters did not instantly repair the wound between us. I told Tessa that her secrecy had hurt me and that I needed her to understand why. She did. She admitted she had repeated Marlene's mistake by assuming silence could protect love. She said she had been terrified that telling me might make me feel our friendship was false, as though every shared memory had been arranged by biology rather than freely chosen. I told her our friendship was real, but trust required honesty, especially when honesty was frightening. Tessa promised she would never again decide what truth I could handle. I did not forgive her because we were sisters. I forgave her because she accepted responsibility without demanding immediate comfort. That distinction mattered. Forgiveness was not pretending the hurt had vanished. It was choosing to rebuild carefully, with clearer boundaries and open hands. Before leaving the farmhouse, we walked into the apple orchard behind Marlene's home. The day was still bright, and the trees cast shifting shadows across the grass. Marlene carried the photograph in her uninjured hand. She told us it had been taken the summer before I was born, when Rebecca, Claire, and she still believed every problem could be solved by loyalty. I asked Marlene to tell me about Claire not as a secret, not as a tragedy, but as a person. She described a woman who sang too loudly in the car, hated cold coffee, rescued injured birds, and never learned to fold fitted sheets. Tessa laughed through her tears because she had inherited every one of those habits. Then Marlene told me Rebecca had visited Claire's grave each year until illness made travel impossible. That truth softened something inside me. My mother had not forgotten Claire. She had lived with the consequences of her choices, loving me while grieving the friend she lost. That I decided not to measure one mother's love against the other's. Rebecca was the mother who raised me, held me, taught me, and stayed. Claire was the mother who gave me life, fought to recover, and loved me from a painful distance. Both women made mistakes. Both carried fear. Both believed they were protecting me. I could condemn their silence without denying their love. Before we left the orchard, Tessa and I stood beside Claire's favorite apple tree and took our first photograph as sisters. There were no dramatic promises, only two women leaning toward each other in the clear afternoon light, still wounded but no longer alone. That evening, while the sun remained above the hills, we returned to my apartment and called my father. He cried before I finished explaining what I had discovered. He admitted he had helped Rebecca maintain the secret because he feared losing me and because shame made honesty harder with each passing year. I told him I loved him, but I also told him trust could not survive another hidden truth. He agreed to answer every question, even the ones that made him uncomfortable. For the first time, my family history was not being guarded by locked boxes, sealed records, or frightened adults. It was being spoken aloud. The truth did not destroy my family. It changed its shape. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. In the comments, tell us whether you believe love can still be genuine when fear causes people to make painful mistakes, and what you think true forgiveness requires. Months later, Tessa and I returned to Marlene's farmhouse with two small frames. One held the old photograph of Rebecca, Claire, and Marlene. The other held our picture beneath the apple tree. We placed them side by side on the sunroom wall. Marlene stood between us, crying softly as morning light filled the room. The past could not be rewritten, and the years of silence could not be returned. But the truth was no longer trapped in a pantry, buried in letters, or carried by one frightened person. It belonged to all of us now. And as Tessa squeezed my hand, I understood that the deepest truth was not simply that my best friend was my sister. It was that family can begin in blood, grow through choice, break beneath fear, and still be rebuilt through honesty, patience, and the courage to forgive.